Hello, welcome to the Short Story Workshop. My name is Matt Bowles. I'm here with Melody Bowles and Simone King. This week we will be reading and discussing A Drama in the Air by Jules Verne. Now, I picked this story. I think it's fascinating. It does some really strange things with structure. It's one of the first of Jules Verne's stories to be translated. He's more widely known for stuff like Journey to the Centre of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, quite famous classical author, and one of the first to do science fiction, although that's hotly debated whether it counts as science fiction or not. But we'll get into that. First, here's a story. I really like the story. It is A Drama in the Air by Jules Verne. In the month of September in the 1850s, I arrived at Frankfurt on the Main. My passage through the principal German cities had been brilliantly marked by balloon ascents, but as yet no German had accompanied me in my car, and the fine experiments made at Paris by M. Green, Eugene Goddard, and Poitevin had not tempted the grave Teutons to essay aerial voyages. But scarcely had the news of my approaching ascent spread through Frankfurt than 3 of the principal citizens begged the favour of being allowed to ascend with me. 2 days afterwards we were to start from the Place de la Comédie. I began at once to get my balloon ready. It was of silk, prepared with gutta percha, a substance impermeable by acids or gases, and its volume, which was 3,000 cubic yards, enabled it to ascend to the loftiest heights. The day of the ascent was that of the great September Fair, which attracts so many people to Frankfurt. Lighting gas, of a perfect quality and of great lifting power, had been furnished to me in excellent condition, and at about 11 o'clock the balloon was filled, but only 3/4 filled, an indispensable precaution. For, as one rises, the atmosphere diminishes in density, and the fluid enclosed within the balloon, acquiring more elasticity, might burst its sides. My calculations had furnished me with exactly the quantity of gas necessary to carry up my companions and myself. We were to start at noon. The impatient crowd which pressed around the enclosed space, filling the enclosed square, overflowing into the contiguous streets, and covering the houses from the ground floor to the slated gables, presented a striking scene. The high winds of the preceding days had subsided. An oppressive heat fell from the cloudless sky. Scarcely a breath animated the atmosphere. In such weather one might descend again upon the very spot whence he had risen. I carried 300 pounds of ballast in bags. The car, quite round, 4 feet in diameter, was comfortably arranged. The hempen cords which supported it stretched symmetrically over the upper hemisphere of the balloon. The compass was in place, the barometer suspended in the circle which united the supporting cords, and the anchor carefully put in order. All was now ready for the ascent. Among those who pressed around the enclosure, I remarked a young man with a pale face and agitated features. The sight of him impressed me. He was an eager spectator of my ascents, whom I had already met in several German cities. With an uneasy air he closely watched the curious machine as it lay motionless a few feet above the ground, and he remained silent among those about him. 12 o'clock came. The moment had arrived, but my travelling companions did not appear. I sent to their houses and learnt that one had left for Hamburg, another for Vienna, and the third for London. Their courage had failed them at the moment of undertaking one of those excursions which, thanks to the ability of living aeronauts, are free from all danger. As they formed, in some sort, a part of the programme of the day, the fear had seized them that they might be forced to execute it faithfully, and they had fled far from the scene at the instant when the balloon was being filled. Their courage was evidently in the inverse ratio of their speed in decamping. The multitude, half deceived, showed not a little ill humour. I did not hesitate to ascend alone. In order to re-establish the equilibrium between the specific gravity of the balloon and the weight which had thus proved wanting, I replaced my companions by more sacks of sand, and got into the car. The 12 men who held the balloon by 12 cords fastened to the equatorial circle let them slip a little between their fingers, and the balloon rose several feet higher. There was not a breath of wind, and the atmosphere was so leaden that it seemed to forbid the ascent. "Is everything ready?" I cried. The men put themselves in readiness. A last glance told me that I might go. "Attention!" There was a movement in the crowd which seemed to be invading the enclosure. "Let go!" The balloon rose slowly, but I experienced a shock which threw me to the bottom of the car. When I got up, I found myself face to face with an unexpected fellow voyager, the pale young man. "Monsieur, I salute you," said he with utmost coolness. "By what right am I here? By the right which the impossibility of your getting rid of me confers." I was amazed. His calmness put me out of countenance, and I had nothing to reply. I looked at the intruder, but he took no notice of my astonishment. "Does my weight disarrange your equilibrium, monsieur?" he asked. "You will permit me?" And without waiting consent, he picked up 2 bags and threw them into space. "Monsieur," said I, taking the only course now possible, "you have come. Very well, you will remain. But to me alone belongs the management of the balloon." "Monsieur," said he, "I morally press the hand you refuse me. Make all precautions and act as seems best to you. I will wait till you have done." "For what?" "To talk with you." The barometer had fallen to 26 inches. We were nearly 600 yards above the city, but nothing betrayed the horizontal displacement of the balloon, for the mass of air in which it is enclosed goes forward with it. A sort of confused glow enveloped the objects spread out under us, and fortunately obscured their outline. I examined my companion afresh. He was a man of 30 years, simply clad. The sharpness of his features betrayed an indomitable energy, and he seemed very muscular. Indifferent to the astonishment he created, he remained motionless, trying in the meantime to distinguish the objects below us. "Miserable mist," said he, after a few moments. I did not reply. "You owe me a grudge," he went on. "Bah! I could not pay for my journey, and it was necessary to take you by surprise." "Nobody asks you to descend, monsieur." "Eh, do you not know, then, that the same thing happened to the Counts of Laurentin and Dampierre when they ascended at Lyons on the 15th of January, 1784? A young merchant named Fontaine scaled the gallery at the risk of capsizing the machine. He accomplished the journey, and nobody died of it." "Once on the ground we will have an explanation," replied I, piqued at the light tone in which he spoke. "Bah! Do not let us think of our return." "Do you think, then, that I shall not hasten to descend?" "Descend," said he in surprise. "Descend? Let us begin by first ascending." And before I could prevent it, 2 more bags had been thrown out of the car, without ever having been emptied. "Monsieur!" I cried, in rage. "I know your ability," replied the unknown quietly, "and your fine ascents are famous. But if experience is the sister of practice, she is also the cousin of theory, and I have studied the aerial arts long. It has got into my head," he added sadly, falling into a silent reverie. The balloon, having risen some distance farther, now became stationary. The unknown consulted the barometer and said, "Here we are at 800 yards. Men are like insects, see? I think we should always contemplate them from this height to judge correctly of their proportions. The Place de la Comédie is transformed into an immense ant-hill. Observe the crowd which is gathered on the quays, and the mountains also get smaller and smaller. We are over the cathedral. The Main is only a line cutting the city in 2, and the bridge seems a thread thrown between the 2 banks of the river." The atmosphere became somewhat chilly. "There is nothing I would not do for you, my host," said the unknown. "If you are cold, I will take off my coat and lend it to you." "Thanks," said I dryly. "Bah! Necessity makes law. Give me your hand. I am your fellow countryman. You will learn something in my company, and my conversation will indemnify you for the trouble I have given you." I sat down, without replying, at the opposite extremity of the car. The young man drew a voluminous manuscript from his coat. It was an essay on ballooning. "I possess," said he, "the most curious collection of engravings and caricatures extant concerning aerial manias. How people admired and scoffed at the same time at this precious discovery. We are happily no longer in the age in which Montgolfier tried to make artificial clouds of steam, or a gas having electrical properties produced by the combustion of moist straw and chopped up wool." "Do you wish to depreciate the talent of the inventors?" I asked, for I had resolved to enter into the adventure. Was it not good to have proved by experience the possibility of rising into the air? "Ah, monsieur, who denies the glory of the first aerial navigators? It requires immense courage to rise by means of those frail envelopes which only contain heated air. But I ask you, has the aerial science made great progress since Blanche's ascensions, that is, since nearly a century ago? Look here, monsieur." The unknown took an engraving from his portfolio. "Here," said he, "is the first aerial voyage undertaken by Pilatre de Rosier and the Marquis de Arlandes, 4 months after the discovery of balloons. Louis XVI refused to consent to the venture, and 2 men who were condemned to death were the first to attempt the aerial ascent. Pilatre de Rosier became indignant at this injustice, and, by means of intrigues, obtained permission to make the experiment. The car, which renders the management easy, had not then been invented, and a circular gallery was placed below the lower and contracted part of the Montgolfier balloon. The 2 aeronauts must then remain motionless at each extremity of this gallery, for the moist straw which filled it forbade them all motion. A chafing dish with fire was suspended below the orifice of the balloon. When the aeronauts wished to rise, they threw straw upon this brazier, at the risk of setting fire to the balloon, and the air, more heated, gave it fresh ascending power. The two bold travellers rose on the 21st of November, 1783, from the Moet Gardens, which the Dauphin had put at their disposal. The balloon went up majestically, passing over the Isle of Swans, across the Seine at the Conference Barrier, and drifting between the Dome of the Invalids and the Military School, approached the Church of St. Sulpice. Then the aeronauts added to the fire, crossed the boulevard, and ascended beyond the Enfer Barrier. As it touched the soil, the balloon collapsed, and for a few moments buried Pilatre de Rosier under its folds. Unlucky augury, I said, interested in the story, which affected me nearly. An augury of the catastrophe which was later cost this unfortunate man his life, replied the unknown sadly. Have you never experienced anything like it? Never. Bah! Misfortunes sometimes occur unforeshadowed, added my companion. He then remained silent. We were drifting southward, and Frankfurt had already passed from beneath us. Perhaps we shall have a storm, said the young man. We shall descend before that, I replied. Better to ascend, we shall escape it more surely. And 2 more bags of sand were hurled into space. The balloon rose rapidly and stopped at 1,200 yards. I became colder, and yet the sun's rays, falling upon the surface, expanded the gas within and gave it a greater ascending force. Fear nothing, said the unknown. We have still 3,500 fathoms of breathing air. Besides, do not trouble yourself about what I do. I would have risen, but a vigorous hand held me to my seat. Your name? I asked. My name? What matters it to you? I demand your name. My name is Erostratus or Empedocles, whichever you choose. This reply was far from reassuring. The unknown, besides, talked with such strange coolness that I anxiously asked myself whom I had to deal with. Monsieur, he continued, nothing original has been imagined since the physicist Charles. 4 months after the discovery of balloons, this man has invented the valve which permits the gas to escape when the balloon is too full, or when you wish to descend, the car which aids the management of the machine, the netting which holds the envelope of the balloon and divides the weight over its whole surface, the ballast which enables you to ascend and to choose the place of your landing, the India rubber coating which renders the tissue impermeable, the barometer which shows the height attained. Lastly, Charles used hydrogen, which 14 times lighter than air, permits you to penetrate to the highest atmospheric regions and does not expose you to the dangers of combustion in the air. On the 1st of December 1783, 3,000 spectators were crowded round the Tuileries. Charles rose, and the soldiers presented arms to him. He travelled 9 leagues in the air, conducting his balloon with an ability not surpassed by modern aeronauts. The king awarded him a pension of 2,000 livres, for they encouraged new inventions. The unknown now seemed to be under the influence of considerable agitation. See, there is Darmstadt, said he, leaning over the car. Do you perceive the chateau? Not very distinctly, eh? What would you have? The heat of the storm makes the outline of objects waver, and you must have a skilled eye to recognize localities. Are you certain it is Darmstadt? I asked. I am sure of it. We are now 6 leagues from Frankfurt. Then we must descend. Descend? You would not go down all the steeples, said the unknown with a chuckle. No, but in the suburbs of the city. Well, let us avoid the steeples. So speaking, my companion seized some bags of ballast. I hastened to prevent him, but he overthrew me with one hand, and the unballasted balloon ascended to 2,000 yards. Rest easy, said he, and do not forget that Brochy, Beard, Gay-Lussac, Brixio, and Barrow ascended to still greater heights to make their scientific experiments. Monsieur, we must descend, I resumed, trying to say to him by gentleness. The storm is gathering around us. It will be more prudent. Bah! We will mount higher than the storm, and we shall no longer fear it, cried my companion. What is nobler than to overlook the clouds which oppress the earth? Is it not an honour for us to navigate on aerial billows? The greatest men have travelled as we are doing. The Marchioness and Countess de Montalembert, the Countess of Pontonez, Mademoiselle Lagarde, the Marquis de Montalembert, rose from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine for these unknown regions, and the Duc de Chartres exhibited much skill and presence of mind as his ascent on the 15th of July 1774. At Lyons, the Counts of Laurencin and Dampierre, at Nantes, M. de Luynes, at Bordeaux, Diable de Grange, in Italy, the Chevalier Andriane, in their own time, the Duke of Brunswick, have all left traces of their glory in the air. To equal these great personages, we must penetrate still higher than they into the celestial depths. To approach the infinite is to comprehend it. The rarefaction of the air was fast expanding the hydrogen in the balloon, and I saw its lower part, purposely left empty, swell out, so that it was absolutely necessary to open the valve, but my companion did not seem to intend that I should manage the balloon as I wished. I then resolved to pull the valve cord secretly, as he was excitedly talking, for I feared to guess with whom I had to deal. It would have been too horrible. It was nearly 1:15. We had been gone 40 minutes from Frankfurt. Heavy clouds were coming against the wind from the south and seemed about to burst upon us. "Have you lost all hope of succeeding in your project?" I asked with anxious interest. "All hope!" exclaimed the unknown in a low voice. "Wounded by slights and caricatures, these asses' kicks have finished me. It is the eternal punishment reserved for innovators. Look at these caricatures of all periods of which my portfolio is full." While my companion was fumbling with his papers, I had seized the valve cord without his perceiving it. I feared, however, that he might hear the hissing noise, like a watercourse, which the gas makes in escaping. "How many jokes were made about the Abbe Milan," said he. "He was to go up with Janet and Bredin. During the filling, their balloon caught fire, and the ignorant populace tore it to pieces. Then this caricature of curious animals appeared, giving each of them a punning nickname." I pulled the valve cord, and the barometer began to ascend. It was time. Some far-off rumblings were heard in the south. "Here is another engraving," resumed the unknown, not suspecting what I was doing. "It is an immense balloon, carrying a ship, strong castles, houses, and so on. The characterists did not suspect that their follies would one day become truths. It is complete, this large vessel. On the left is its helm, with the pilot's box, the prow, a pleasure houses, an immense organ, and a cannon to call the attention of the inhabitants of the earth or the moon. Above the poop there are the observatory and the balloon longboat. In the equatorial circle, the army barrack. On the left, the funnel, then the upper galleries for promenading, sails, pinions. Below, the cafes and general storehouse. Observe this pompous announcement. Invented for the happiness of the human race, this globe will depart at once for the ports of the Levant, and on its return the programme of its voyages to the two poles and the extreme west will be announced. No one need furnish himself with anything. Everything is foreseen, and all will prosper. Flush pleasure will be the soul of the aerial company. All this provoked laughter, but before long, if I am not cut off, they will see it all realised." We were visibly descending. He did not perceive it. "This kind of game at balloons," he resumed, spreading out before me some of the engravings of his valuable collection. "This game contains the entire history of the aerostatic art. It is used by elevated minds and displayed with dice and counters, with whatever stakes you like, to be paid or received according to where the player arrives." "Why," said I, "you seem to have studied the science of aerostation profoundly." "Yes, monsieur, yes. From Phaeton, Icarus, Archytas, I have searched for, examined, learned everything. I could render immense services to the world in this art if God granted me life, but that will not be." "Why?" "Because my name is Empedocles or Erostratus." Meanwhile, the balloon was happily approaching the earth, but when one is falling, the danger is as great at 100 feet as at 5,000. "Do you recall the Battle of Fleurus?" resumed my companion, whose face became more and more animated. "It was at that battle that Contello, by order of the government, organised a company of balloonists. At the siege of Montberge, General Jourdan derived so much service from this new method of observation that Contello ascended twice a day with the general himself. The communications between the aeronaut and his agents who held the balloon were made by means of small white, red, and yellow flags. Often the gun and cannon shot were directed upon the balloon when he ascended, but without result. When General Jourdan was preparing to invest Charleroi, Contello went into the vicinity, ascended from the plain of Jumet, and continued his observations for 7 or 8 hours with General Morlot, and this no doubt aided in giving us the victory of Fleurus. General Jourdan publicly acknowledged the help which the aeronautical observations had afforded him. Well, despite the services rendered on that occasion and during the Belgian campaign, the year which had seen the beginning of the military career of balloons saw also its end. The school of Meudon, founded by the government, was closed by Bonaparte on his return from Egypt. And now, what can you expect from the newborn infant? As Franklin said, if the infant was born alive, it should not be stifled. The unknown bowed his head in his hands for some moments. Then rousing himself, he said, "Despite my prohibition, monsieur, you have opened the valve." I dropped the cord. "Happily," he resumed, "we have still 300 pounds of ballast." "What is your purpose?" said I. "Have you ever crossed the seas?" said he. I turned pale. "It is unfortunate," he went on, "that we are driven towards the Adriatic. That is only a stream, but higher up we may find other currents." And, without taking any notice of me, he threw over several bags of sand. Then, in a menacing voice, he said, "I let you open the valve because the expanding gas threatened to burst the balloon. Do not do it again." Then he went on. "You remember the voyage of Blanchard and Jeffreys from Dover to Calais? It was magnificent. On the 7th of January 1785, there being a northwest wind, their balloon was inflated with gas on the Dover coast. A mistake of equilibrium, just as they were ascending, forced them to throw out their ballast so that it might not go down again, and they only kept 30 pounds. It was too little. For as the wind did not freshen, they only advanced very slowly towards the French coast. Besides, the permeability of the tissue served to reduce the inflation little by little, and in an hour and a half, the aeronauts perceived that they were descending. "What shall we do?" said Jeffreys. "We are only 1/4 of the way over," replied Blanchard, "and very low down. On rising, we shall perhaps meet more favourable winds. Let us throw out the rest of the sand." The balloon acquired some ascending force, but it soon began to descend again. Toward the middle of the transit, the aeronauts threw over their books and tools. A quarter of an hour after, Blanchard said to Jeffreys, "The barometer? It is going up. We are lost, and yet there is the French coast." A loud noise was heard. "Has the balloon burst?" asked Jeffreys. "No, the loss of the gas has reduced the inflation of the lower part of the balloon, but we are still descending. We are lost. Out with everything useless." Provisions, oars, and rudder were thrown into the sea. The aeronauts were only 100 yards high. "We are going up again," said the doctor. "No, it is the spurt caused by the diminution of the weight, and not a ship in sight, not a bark on the horizon. To the sea with our clothing!" The unfortunates stripped themselves, but the balloon continued to descend. "Blanchard," said Jeffreys, "you should have made this voyage alone. You consented to take me. I will sacrifice myself. I am going to throw myself into the water, and the balloon, relieved of my weight, will mount again." "No, no, it is frightful." The balloon became less and less inflated, and as it doubled up its concavity pressed the gas against the sides and hastened its downward course. "Adieu, my friend. God preserve you." He was about to throw himself over when Blanchard held him back. "There is one more chance," said he. "We can cut the cords which hold the car and cling to the net. Perhaps the balloon will rise. Let us hold ourselves ready. But the barometer is going down. The wind is freshening. We are saved." The aeronauts perceived Calais. Their joy was delirious. A few moments more, and they had fallen in the forest of Guines. "I do not doubt," added the unknown, "that under similar circumstances you would have followed Dr. Jeffreys' example." The clouds rolled in glittering masses beneath us. The balloon threw large shadows on them, and was surrounded as by an aureola. The thunder rumbled below the car. All this was terrifying. "Let us descend," I cried. "Descend when the sun is up there waiting for us? Out with more bags!" And more than 50 pounds of ballast were cast over. At a height of 3,500 yards, we remained stationary. The unknown talked unceasingly. I was in a state of complete prostration, while he seemed to be in his element. "With a good wind, we shall go far," he cried. "In the Antilles there are currents of air which have a speed of 100 leagues an hour. When Napoleon was crowned, Gardner had sent up a balloon with coloured lamps at 11 o'clock at night. The wind was blowing north-northwest. The next morning at daybreak the inhabitants of Rome greeted its passage over the dome of St. Peter's. We shall go farther and higher." I scarcely heard him. Everything whirled around me. An opening appeared in the clouds. "See that city," said the unknown. "It is spires." I leaned over the car and perceived a small blackish mass. It was spires. The Rhine, which is so large, seemed an unrolled ribbon. The sky was a deep blue over our heads. The birds had long abandoned us, for in that rarefied air they could not have flown. We were alone in space, and I in the presence of this unknown. "It is useless for you to know whither I am leading you," he said, as he threw the compass among the clouds. "Ah, a fall is a grand thing. You know that but few victims of ballooning are to be reckoned, from Pilatre de Rosier to Lieutenant Gale, and that the accidents have always been the result of imprudence. Pilatre de Rosier set out with Romain of Boulogne on the 13th of June 1785. His gas balloon he had fixed a Montgolfier apparatus of hot air so as to dispense, no doubt, with the necessity of losing gas or throwing out ballast. It was putting a torch under a powder barrel. When they had ascended 400 yards and were taken by opposing winds, they were driven over the open sea. Pilatre, in order to descend, essayed to open the valve, but the valve cord became entangled in the balloon and tore it so badly that it became empty in an instant. It fell upon the Montgolfier apparatus, overturned it, and dragged down the unfortunates, who were soon shattered to pieces. It is frightful, is it not?" I could only reply, "For pity's sake, let us descend." The clouds gathered around us on every side, and dreadful detonations, which reverberated in the cavity of the balloon, took place beneath us. "You provoke me," cried the unknown, "and you shall no longer know whether we are rising or falling." The barometer went the way of the compass, accompanied by several more bags of sand. We must have been 5,000 yards high. Some icicles had already attached themselves to the sides of the car, and a kind of fine snow seemed to penetrate to my very bones. Meanwhile, a frightful tempest was raging under us, but we were above it. "Do not be afraid," said the unknown. "It is only the imprudent who are lost." Olivari, who perished at Orleans, rose in a paper montgolfier. His car, suspended below the chafing dish and ballasted with combustible materials, caught fire. Olivari fell and was killed. Mosmont rose at Lille on a light tray. An oscillation disturbed his equilibrium. Mosmont fell and was killed. Biddulph at Mannerheim saw his balloon catch fire in the air, and he too fell and was killed. Harris rose in a badly constructed balloon, the valve of which was too large and would not shut. Harris fell and was killed. Sadler, deprived of ballast by his long sojourn in the air, was dragged over the town of Boston and dashed against the chimneys. Sadler fell and was killed. Cockling descended with a convex parachute, which he pretended to have perfected. Cockling fell and was killed. Well, I love them, these victims of their own imprudence, and I shall die as they did. Higher, still higher! All the phantoms of this necrology passed before my eyes. The rarefaction of the air and the sun's rays added to the expansion of the gas, and the balloon continued to mount. I tried to open the valve, but the unknown cut the cord several feet above my head. I was lost. "Did you see Madame Blanchard fall?" said he. "I saw her, yes. It was on Tivoli on the 6th of July, 1819. Madame Blanchard rose in a small-sized balloon to avoid the expense of filling, and she was forced to inflate it entirely. The gas leaked out below and left a regular train of hydrogen in its path. She carried with her a sort of pyrotechnic aureola, suspended below her car by a wire which was to set off in the air. This she had done many times before. On this day she also carried up a small parachute ballasted by a firework contrivance that would go off in a shower of silver. She was to start this contrivance after having lighted it with a port fire made on purpose. She set out. The night was gloomy. At the moment of lighting her firework she was so imprudent as to pass the taper under the column of hydrogen which was leaking from the balloon. My eyes were fixed upon her. Suddenly an unexpected gleam lit up the darkness. I thought she was preparing a surprise. The light flashed out, suddenly disappeared and reappeared, and gave the summit of the balloon the shape of an immense jet of ignited gas. This sinister glow shed itself over the boulevard and the whole Montmartre quarter. Then I saw the unhappy woman rise, try twice to close the appendage of the balloon so as to put out the fire, then sit down in her car and try to guide her descent, for she did not fall. The combustion of the gas lasted for several minutes. The balloon, becoming gradually less, continued to descend, but it was not a fall. The wind blew from the northwest and drove it towards Paris. There were then some large gardens just by the house number 16, Rue de Promise. Madame Blanchard essayed to fall there without danger, but the balloon in the car struck on the roof of the house with a light shock. "Save me!" cried the wretched woman. I got into the street at this moment. The car slid along the roof and encountered an iron cramp. Madame Blanchard was thrown out of the car and precipitated upon the pavement. She was killed! These stories froze me with horror. The unknown was standing with bare head, dishevelled hair, haggard eyes. There was no longer any illusion possible. I recognized the horrible truth. I was in the presence of a madman. He threw out the rest of the ballast, and we must now have reached a height of at least 9,000 yards. Blood spurted from my nose and mouth. "Who are nobler than the martyrs of science?" cried the lunatic. "They are canonized by posterity." But I no longer heard him. He bent down to my ear and muttered, "And have you not forgotten Zambacari's catastrophe? Listen. On the 7th of October, 1804, the clouds seemed to lift a little. On the preceding days, the wind and rain had not ceased, but the announced ascension of Zambacari could not be postponed. His enemies were already bantering him. It was necessary to ascend to save the science and himself from becoming a public jest. It was at Boulogne. No one helped to inflate his balloon. He rose at midnight, accompanied by Andreoli and Grassetti. The balloon mounted slowly, for it had been perforated by the rain, and the gas was leaking out. The three intrepid aeronauts could only observe the state of the barometer by aid of a dark lantern. Zambacari had eaten nothing for 24 hours. Grassetti was also fasting. "My friends," said Zambacari, "I am overcome by cold and exhausted. I am dying." He fell inanimate in the gallery. It was the same with Grassetti. Andreoli alone remained conscious. After long efforts, he succeeded in reviving Zambacari. "What news? Whither are we going? How is the wind? What time is it?" "It is 2 o'clock." "Where is the compass?" "Upset." "Great God, the lantern's gone out." "It cannot burn in this rarefied air," said Zambacari. The moon had not risen, and the atmosphere was plunged in murky darkness. "I am cold, Andreoli. What shall I do?" They slowly descended through a layer of whitish clouds. "Shh!" said Andreoli. "Do you hear?" "What?" asked Zambacari. "A strange noise." "You are mistaken. Consider these travellers in the middle of the night listening to that unaccountable noise. Are they going to knock against the tower? Are they about to be precipitated on the roofs? Do you hear? One would say it was the sea. Impossible is the groaning of the waves. It is true. Light, light. After 5 fruitless attempts, Andreoli succeeded in obtaining light. It was 3 o'clock. The voice of violent waves was heard. They were almost touching the surface of the sea. "We are lost!" cried Zambacari, seizing a bag of sand. "Help!" cried Andreoli. The car touched the water and the waves came up to their breasts. "Throw out the instruments! Close!" The aeronauts completely stripped themselves. The balloon, relieved, rose with frightful rapidity. Zambacari was taken with vomiting. Grassetti bled profusely. The unfortunate men could not speak, so short was their breathing. They were taken with cold, and they were soon crusted over with ice. The moon looked as red as blood. After traversing the high regions for a half hour, the balloon again fell into the sea. It was 4 a.m. They were half submerged in the water, and the balloon dragged them along as if under sail for several hours. At daybreak, they found themselves opposite Pizarro, 5 miles from the coast. They were about to reach it when a gale blew them back into the open sea. They were lost. The frightened boats fled at their approach. Happily, a more intelligent boatman accosted them, hoisted them on board, and they landed at Ferrada. A frightful journey, was it not? But Zambacari was a brave and energetic man. Scarcely removed from his sufferings, he resumed his ascensions. During one of them, he struck against a tree, his spirit lamp was broken on his clothes, he was enveloped in fire, his balloon began to catch the flames, and he came down half consumed. At last, on the 21st of September 1812, he made another ascension at Boulogne. The balloon clung to a tree, and his lamp again set it on fire. Zambacari fell and was killed. And in presence of these facts, we would still hesitate. No, the higher we go, the more glorious will be our death. The balloon being now entirely relieved of ballast and of all it contained, we were carried to an enormous height. It vibrated in the atmosphere. The least noise resounded in the vaults of heaven. Our globe, the only object which caught my view in immensity, seemed ready to be annihilated, and above us the depths of the starry skies were lost in thick darkness. I saw my companion rise up before me. "The hour is come," he said. "We must die. We are rejected of men. They despise us. We will not endure it. Let us crush them." "Mercy," I cried. "Let us cut these cords. Let this car be abandoned in space. The attractive force will change its direction, and we shall approach the sun." Despair galvanized me. I threw myself upon the madman. We struggled together, and a terrible conflict took place. But I was thrown down, and while he held me under his knee, the madman was cutting the cords of the car. "One!" he cried. "My God! 2, 3! I made a superhuman effort, rose up, and violently repulsed the madman. 4! The car fell, but I instinctively clung to the cords and hoisted myself into the meshes of the netting. The madman disappeared in space. The balloon was raised to an immeasurable height. A horrible cracking was heard. The gas, too much dilated, had burst the balloon. I shut my eyes. Some instants after, a damp warmth revived me. I was in the midst of clouds on fire. The balloon turned over with dizzy velocity. Taken by the wind, it made 100 leagues an hour in a horizontal course, the lightning flashing around it. Meanwhile, my fall was not a very rapid one. When I opened my eyes, I saw the country. I was 2 miles from the sea, and the tempest was driving me violently towards it, when an abrupt shock forced me to loosen my hold. My hands opened, a cord slipped swiftly between my fingers, and I found myself on the solid earth. It was the cord of the anchor, which, sweeping along the surface of the ground, was caught in a crevice, and my balloon, unballasted for the last time, careered off to lose itself beyond the sea. When I came to myself, I was in bed in a peasant's cottage at Harderwijk, a village of La Gouldre, 15 leagues from Amsterdam, on the shores of the Zuider Zee. A miracle had saved my life, but my voyage had been a series of imprudences committed by a lunatic, and I had not been able to prevent them. May this terrible narrative, though instructing those who read it, not discourage the explorers of the air. So, what are your first impressions?
I like this story because I like stories that deal with a sane person and a crazy person stuck in a confined space.
He is insane.
I feel like I should have liked the story, but I didn't.
Oh no, why not?
The writing style and all the long monologues were just really painful to try and get through. They broke up what should have been a really tense story, because the idea of being trapped with someone in a hot air balloon is brilliant. I absolutely love it. But then I read the story and it's like, I'm not even tense, I'm just struggling.
The info dumping was a little bit too much for you, maybe.
Yeah, the info dumping was definitely too much for me, and I don't care about the history of hot air balloons. I'm sorry. Like, make your dialogue a bit more snappy. Like, I'm aware that might be part of him, the unknown character, being a bit loopy, but no.
I quite liked the contrast of him rambling on, and the narrator just trying to get a word in edgeways. Being like, hey, maybe we should, stop chucking stuff out the balloon. No, okay.
Like, I can see how it worked with the tension slowly notching up from, like, the people not turning up on time to him suddenly being in the hot air balloon to him throwing off the bags and continuing to do so and kind of seeming increasingly crazed. I can see how it would work. It just didn't work for me because of all the monologues on the filler that kept making me drift slightly.
Did you enjoy the monologues, Matt?
Yeah, I actually thought they were really interesting. I liked the very ridiculous stories that were all true, by the way, for the most part, about people trying to achieve like something that was really quite ambitious at the time, but then failing. But then this character has this weird obsession with them because they've all died in what he thinks are like miraculous, like incredible ways, and that makes them worth remembering, and they're somehow envious. And I thought that was a really interesting idea.
I can see that.
I also like that it's got so many different arcs in it. Like you have the arc where you realize that this guy is absolutely crazy, and then you realize no, he's even more crazy than that. But you also have the other character, the narrator's arc, where at the start he's like, "Ah, oh, these people didn't want to get on my balloon. What a bunch of cowards! It's perfectly safe." And then at the end, he's starting to reconsider a little bit.
I do love that line where he says of the people who didn't turn up, their courage was evidently in invert ratio of their speed in camping.
Yeah, it's a very long-winded way of saying they're cowards.
He used science to deliver a classy diss, and I enjoyed that.
I also feel like this is a story that does better in audio form. I think, as Simone said, when you are just reading it on the page, these big blocks of random history in the middle is a bit intimidating. But when you're listening to it, it's not the same. It doesn't bother you as much, I think.
Interesting. Maybe I'll try listening to this episode after to see if you managed to change my opinion.
I listened to it first. I was listening to Matt's recording. I got a much different tone of the story from listening to the way he told it rather than reading it. So when I was reading it, I realised I was reading the monologues quite slowly because there was quite a lot of densely packed information in there to try and get my head round. But when Matt was reading it, he was reading it so fast that it made the guy seem more crazy, lent him that mad professor air that I think is probably what Verne was going for, and I don't know, just sort of solidified the character for me with his performance. Because I guess if you read it just as it is, it does just sound like he's giving you a very long lecture like a professor in a classroom.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why I read those parts faster is because I knew they were less important to the overarching story. And when I was reading it myself, I found myself skipping through them. You say you slowed down because you're trying to take in the information. When I was reading it, I was speeding up. I was like, oh, get to the rest of the story.
I mean, I slowed down at first, and then by the end, I was kind of being like, get to it, come on, stop talking.
I want to talk a bit about the structure of how we have like mini stories inside the story, which is not something you see very often. And I'm assuming, Simone, you think that's not good.
I think it's a great tool, and I think it could have worked really well. Maybe it's the way it was translated that didn't work for me. Like, I think as a general concept, having the stories in there would be really good and a really great way to shed more light on the situation and the character, because it kind of proves all the other ways this could go horribly wrong. But because of the way he told them, I didn't care.
What about you, Mel? What do you think about the idea of having stories within story?
I've seen it done before in a longer book, like a novel, not a short story. And I really liked it in the book. I thought it worked really well and I enjoyed it.
I mean, it came across in The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, which I just read, which was completely filled with stories upon stories, written over stories. Like, the whole point was it was stories stacked upon stories, talking about storytelling. And I think that worked really well. I think the stories need to come together and end to a particular conclusion to not feel extraneous. I almost feel like they need to reveal something or lead to something. Like, oh, at the end, oh, they suddenly fit in.
So in this story, I suppose the idea of those stories was to show how dangerous what they were doing actually is. And you feel like that wasn't perhaps enough to tie into the story. You wanted something a bit more concrete, maybe?
I mean, if you wanted to know how dangerous it was, you can do that with the characters' reactions, and you also don't need that many stories. Like, you could have stuck to, I don't know, a nice 3 or something. There was just so many of them.
It's because they didn't sound natural as well in the way that they were being told. They sounded like they were being read from a book almost.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, the character was reading them, but it could also be that the way the translation worked out, it sounds a bit stilted.
Yeah, I think it sounds very formal and stiff almost. I don't know how I feel about them in this context. I think they were interesting, but I wish that they'd been told a bit differently.
I agree that there is probably a bit too much.
Yeah.
I didn't really have any problems with the style of it. It's very factual, but I feel like that was kind of the idea, was that the character was very informed and knew all the little details about these things.
I think it was because the narrative style otherwise was also quite dense, so there wasn't really any point that broke from it. I'm also aware that was more of a convention of writing back in that day anyway, so I think maybe if I was a reader at that time, it wouldn't have bothered me as much. But as a contemporary reader who reads a lot of contemporary novels, I'm used to less dense writing, I guess.
I want to talk a little bit about just looking at the framing story of these characters being on this hot air balloon and then going higher and higher and then almost crashing. Because I think if you just look at that part on its own, it tells you something different. I think it shows you this very simple structure of the story, and that you have pretty much all the necessary parts to make a story, but it's so slim because that's to allow room for these stories that are nested inside. And I feel like he's got the characters, he's got the tension, he's got the sense of progress of the bags being thrown over the side and then climbing higher and higher. And I thought that was a really interesting idea, that he had all these, he had really distilled down to what the minimum amount of story you could really have, and then made that work.
The fact that it was such a good premise for a story just irritates me, because it could have been so good. Why?
I mean,
I still enjoyed it.
I really liked it, so.
I mean, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Like, he's clearly a good writer in that he managed to pinpoint what those very base elements that he needed was in order to have the room to do his stories without the entire structure completely falling apart.
Yeah. I just want to note how important that sense of progress is, because sometimes people it's easy to overlook, but just having that feeling that they're slowly getting higher and higher and closer towards danger. Just that very simple idea is enough to drive the story.
It creates suspense, as did when he was trying to lower the hot air balloon secretly by holding the valve while the unknown was telling the story. Like, that kind of created an additional sense of tension, I think, because you knew he was going to find out, or at least suspected, but you didn't know when it was going to come, and he was just talking, so that kind of worked well.
Yeah, and the more of those stories he told about people getting themselves in trouble while they were experimenting with air balloons, the more anxious you and the narrator feels, because I'm sure he has like a long sort of rant where he ends every sentence with "and then they died, and then they died, and then they died."
You got it. It's and was killed.
Oh, I was almost there.
I love that part. I love it.
I think that was one of my favorite parts, because that was the point where you were like, okay, this is not good. Very, very not good. So not only have you got them getting higher and higher and him throwing out more and more airbags, you've got his stories ramping up and up to explain how dangerous and likely they are to die the whole time.
They just get more and more ridiculous. I couldn't believe that some of these are true, but they seem like they are.
What's your favorite one that's true?
The one where the lady, she's setting off like the fireworks and then it goes wrong, and then she ends up in this slow, like uncontrolled descent, but then she lands on the roof of this building and it's like, oh, well, that's okay then. But then she falls out anyway and dies because she falls off the roof. It's like, it's so, I think that one really shows how dangerous it was, Because there's a line in it where he says, when you're falling, it doesn't matter if you're 100 feet up or 5,000 feet. And that story drove home that point to me.
That's a good point.
Okay, should we talk about the unknown?
Sure.
I really like this character because first you think he's just a bit zany, maybe a bit eccentric. He sneaks his way onto this hot air balloon, and you're like, I mean, at least the guy's got some company, I suppose, as everybody else didn't want to do it. Then he starts talking, and he doesn't stop.
Captive audience, literally.
Yeah, and we don't know anything about this guy apart from he's obsessed with sort of air balloons and the scientists who like make them, I suppose. And at one point, when he does sort of say, "You can call me," I think it's Erostratus and Empedocles. I'm sure I've butchered the Greek pronunciations.
Oh yeah, me too.
Yeah, I was very curious about who these people were, so I looked them up. And an Erostratus, someone who commits a criminal act to become famous. Cool, got it. Empedocles, he has a famous legend about his death in which he threw himself into a volcano to prove a point, to prove that he disappeared, or I can't remember quite what the wiki says, but I was just like, okay.
Interesting.
So, does that mean that this unknown is aware he's crazy? What is his motivation?
Those two figures kind of mirror his own ideas, right? He seems to believe that if he can die in some dramatic way, that it makes him important.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people really want to leave like a legacy behind, and I think it's just a really twisted version of that, where he's like, if I do die in this stupendous way, everyone will remember me, and I'll become important.
Would you say there's any truth to that?
I think it's pretty foolish. I think that any fame you get that way will probably be short-lived, so then what's the point? But I can kind of understand it.
Have you heard of the Darwin Awards? They are, well, I'm trying to think of a nice way to phrase this. They are voted for each year, and they contain a short list of people who have died by their own hand in very, very silly ways.
Oh wow, that's morbid.
Yeah, and I'm guessing if this man was in the modern era, he would probably be on that list.
Yeah, I'd say that counts.
I mean, people do stupid things all the time, don't they, for the sake of fame and glory? Like, you get all those people who try and climb Everest despite not being actual climbers.
Yeah, they do get themselves in trouble, some people doing stuff like that.
So I guess although this guy is crazy and eccentric, he is in a somewhat believable way.
Yeah, like you could totally see some nut job these days doing that.
He's also well educated.
Being well educated doesn't stop you from being a nut job, it just means you can be better at hiding it.
I know, I just thought it was interesting to note that even though he's crazy, it sort of feels like he's somewhat self-aware.
He has a weird line where he's like, "Oh, it's got into my head."
Yeah.
All this stuff about air travel has got in my head. He seems to know that he's a little crazy. That is true.
Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to ask you was if you think that he and the narrator are foils in this story. So I'm actually not sure. When I first thought about it, I was like, oh, I see, they're foiling each other. But I then read a definition that said foils don't oppose each other, and I guess these two are in opposition because they both want control of the balloon.
So how would you define a foil?
Usually it's characters who are opposites, so they emphasize each other's traits. So the insanity of this unknown makes the narrator seem much more grounded than perhaps he is, considering he's somebody who's going up in a hot air balloon.
Yeah. I'd say there are foils. In many ways, they are opposites. In terms of their sanity is probably the most obvious.
Yeah.
And their faith in the balloons is another one. Yeah, I'd say that their opposing views make each other stronger.
Yeah, and I kind of really love when that's used well in stories. I
do love a foil, but
You're not sure if it counts?
I'm trying to decide. This literary term is named after an old jewellery trick of setting a gem on a foil base to enhance its shine. It's not just being an opposite, it's to spotlight certain traits, and while you could say that the sanity and the insanity form a spotlight, it doesn't feel like he's trying to make a point about, oh, this guy's sane because of this guy being insane. It feels more like this guy is insane, and that's coming across to the point of drowning out rather than foiling almost.
Yeah, that makes sense actually. So the narrator is less important in the grand scheme of things, maybe?
I feel like they're kind of there, and the unknown is very much centre stage.
Yeah, but then could you not say it's the other way around and the POV character is the foil? Because his groundedness does make the unknown seem crazier, I think.
Yeah, I suppose it makes sense actually if you view the unknown as the protagonist. It's the foil, it's the unknown who almost completes the character arc, I guess, and is the driving force and whose story completes. While we don't really get a sense of the POV character's motivations to really get the payoff at the end because they were just in it for a trip. Like, they didn't intend to go spiraling off stage. They didn't have any specific plans for what they wanted to accomplish, I guess, beyond living and surviving. Whereas the unknown was very much trying to achieve something. So I think if you read the unknown as the...
I disagree. I think the POV character does have clear motivations and that he's trying to demonstrate air travel to people and in particular how safe it is. And he obviously kind of fails in that. And that shows in his arc where he changes his mind at the end and he says, okay, I don't want to dissuade anyone from air travel, but this is actually pretty dangerous.
Yeah, okay, fair.
I agree that the contrasting traits flow perhaps in one direction more than the other. I think it has the key idea, which is that because they contrast, they kind of make each other stronger.
There is also an argument that subplot can be foil, in which cases that make the characters in the unknown stories the foils to the unknown, or to the POV character.
That's an interesting idea, because in some ways they are opposites in that they've all failed and died.
Whereas he's the one who, despite all of the odds, survived. They had miraculous deaths, and he had a miraculous survival.
Yeah, it's true.
So I just wanted to mention that this is one of the more dialogue-heavy stories that we've looked at, and I wanted to know if you guys thought that the dialogue was used well, or if you think that it could have been used a bit differently, or if you'd rather have had a different way to deliver the story.
I feel like there's so much dialogue in this story that it almost becomes part of the narration, and it kind of blurs that line anyway.
Yeah.
I would agree with that.
The unknown has a really sort of distinctive speaking style. It's very formal, uses repetition a lot. It's very specific, uses names, places, dates.
I mean, I've seen like some entire like books have just been entirely told for the most part. Like you just have all dialogue, and at that point, it just becomes part of the story as it's in that voice. Dialogue only really counts as dialogue in my brain if it's distinctly separate from the rest of the text, and this one kind of blurs that line. They become almost the same.
I think that puts the finger on the thing that was making me go, about the way it was used in the story.
It's normally considered bad form to have dialogue as exposition, at least nowadays. But in this one, it kind of relies on that as a more interesting way of doing exposition. I mean, you know my feelings about the info dump. It's not snappy dialogue that has me on the edge of my seat.
You like a bit of banter, a bit of back and forth.
Yeah, that said, it would have been worse if it wasn't in dialogue.
So you think that the dialogue was the best way to execute this?
I mean, yeah, the other alternative would have been having him read the snippets of the articles. Then it really would feel like, oh my god, reading within reading. The dialogue at least revealed character.
Alright, so this story was translated from French, and it was translated quite a long time ago. It was the first of Jules Verne's stories to be translated to English, and some of the translations have been people aren't so keen on them now. It's not just Jules Verne that we're reading, it's also whoever translated it, and actually translation can have a really big effect on what the story is, because I think a lot of his work, when it was translated to English, people thought, oh, they're like children's stories, and they kind of dumb things down sometimes. Do you think that translation is as important as what the original author wrote, or Is it less important? Where is it on that scale?
I think the way we translate texts is absolutely critical to our understanding of them, particularly with longer texts or texts, I guess, from different languages. Like, they bring so much nuance to it, and what we choose to include in a translation versus what we choose to omit leaves massive marks on our literary canon and on the meaning of the story and the characters. Like, even, like, say you refer to something in English as a house and a home has so many more different connotations than a house does. It can drastically change the story.
I think a good translation will convey the author's original intent, but not always their original words, because there might be some things that need changing for English. And I've seen this a few times because me and Matt like video games, and a lot of them, the ones we like, are translated from Japanese. Now, there is so much nonsense on the internet about how things should have been translated or whether they were translated well because of the nuances of that language.
Can I give an example?
Yes.
You allow me to slot a video game example into this podcast. Final Fantasy VIII, Squall, he is translated as saying whatever a lot in the English version. But almost every instance of whatever that we see in English is a different word in the Japanese version. That is not consistent. However, if Squall did not say whatever all of the time, he would not be the same character that us English audiences like, right?
Yes. Yeah, because that adds to who he is, and it's like a universal teenage phrase, isn't it? And Squall is supposed to be a moody teenager, and that's such a good way to communicate it in English. So yeah, I think it's important that the meaning is the same, even if the words are different.
Yeah, the heart and the theme of the story as opposed to the actual words.
Yeah.
Like, I think a lot of translators make the mistake of trying to do too direct a translation. I mean, you can make the same point about adaptations in the sense that if you're doing it in a different format, you need to change some things to keep to the heart of the story while matching the medium you were in.
Yes. I mean, being unable to speak French, I can't really comment, but I do wonder if perhaps the slightly awkward phrasing of some of the sentences in this story is because of the translation.
Yeah, I imagine it might be. I also think it's interesting how, I've read a few translations of Japanese books, and they have the same rhythm to the text. It's hard to explain, but I can tell they've been translated from the same language.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. Something about the rhythm.
Yeah.
I think they can be really distinctive if you take two languages such as English and Japanese, which are so different, because I think it becomes a lot more obvious then than, say, if you were translating, I don't know, French to Italian, for example, which comes from the same base. I'm bilingual, well, mostly, with English and Finnish, and I can feel a lot of changes in my personality and the way I convey things when I try and talk in Finnish versus when I talk in English, just because of the nature of the vocabulary available to you and the way that you phrase things. Like, for example, Finnish doesn't have a word for she and for him and her, and it doesn't have a word for please, so it automatically changes the way you have to say things. I think that affects how they're translated, because it's the idea that not everything is going to be translatable because we don't have words that match across all languages.
Yes. Yeah.
So some people say that Jules Verne is the father of science fiction, a phrase that has been given to many people, including H.G. Wells. And others have debated this and said, no, his work isn't science fiction. And some of the ideas they bring up is that Jules Verne rarely extrapolated science. He would use science that was around at the time, and then sometimes he'd invent things which were a little more... He'd invent things that weren't around at the time, but he didn't really do it using any scientific basis. He just invented stuff that he needed for the story to work. As opposed to someone like H.G. Wells, who looked at science that was happening at the time, looked at all the ideas about the fourth dimension, and then wrote, the time machine, and was like, okay, here is a novel kind of expanding on current scientific ideas and using real science. So people have debated whether Jules Verne's stories are actually science fiction or not. How do we feel about this? Is there a kind of a way to define science fiction? Is it clean cut? Are there different types?
I would say this is fiction with science in it. When I think of science fiction, I think of something a bit more speculative, I suppose. I think of Jurassic Park or Aliens or a time machine.
Yeah, so even though this story features science quite prominently, it is entirely grounded in reality, really, is what you're saying.
Yeah, but then there's like hard science fiction, and isn't that based on real science or uses real science?
Yes, but they are extrapolating, right? They're taking real science and then saying, well, if we did this thing, then this would happen. Whereas this story doesn't really do that. It uses things that definitely do exist.
Yeah, I think for me, for it to be science fiction, it has to be fiction first, science second. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yeah. I know. You wouldn't be the first to try and define science fiction. There's an entire Wikipedia article on different people's definitions of science fiction, and none of them agree.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to get our ideas of what fits together here. I mean, what even makes a genre? How do you draw the lines?
Lines are hard to draw. You can't really draw them. You end up with loads of subgenres anyway. Like, I think that's wonderful about genre fiction though, because it's infinite.
Like Isaac Asimov in 1975 defined science fiction can be defined as that branch of literature which deals with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology. Under that, then, this story could possibly come as science fiction. However, in my heart, it is not a science fiction story. Also, side note, but the first science fiction writer, and I will fight you on this, was Mary Shelley with Frankenstein.
Yes, I've heard that argument before. It's another case of nobody can agree on who started it. And honestly, nobody did start it. It's not clear cut, right?
I mean, I'm still going to go with Mary Shelley over Jules Verne.
Yeah, but are you saying that nobody wrote science fiction or anything vaguely like it until Mary Shelley?
Honestly, I haven't read that many classic books to be able to make an informed argument on that front. I haven't specifically studied science fiction. Not my favourite genre, but I know Frankenstein was an earlier example that was at least popularised.
Yeah, I'm just trying to make the point that you can't really say this was when science fiction was invented. It was kind of a gradual process.
I mean, presumably you'd need some concept of science for science fiction to exist.
Yep. And our ideas about modern science are relatively new, as we found out in the Edgar Allan Poe episode.
So would you define the story as science fiction then, Matt?
It's difficult. I kind of want to because it does talk about science more than is necessary, and it contains more exposition than you would normally find in a story, which I think is a hallmark of science fiction. But I do also see the point that it's not really inventing anything new. It's not exploring a particular idea. The science is just kind of there. So I don't know. It's on the boundary. Probably not, but I can see both sides.
I mean, it depends on what your personal definition is. Like, what do you think of when you think of science fiction?
Yeah, I think everyone's going to have a different answer, right?
Like, fantasy is so broad. I have to constantly argue with people that whether or not something is fantasy or not. It's not all elves and dragons.
Yeah.
Yeah, you say, oh, I write fantasy. You must be writing about elves. No, that's Tolkien.
All right. Very quickly, a few things about Jules Verne. He didn't have much luck in writing for a long time, as is traditionally true. But then he kind of got into it via like edutainment, where he's like, oh, I can write stories that kind of show people how science and geography is and how cool it is. And that's going to be like, I'm just going to make a story around it as like a delivery mechanism, essentially. And so his work was serialized in magazines kind of for that purpose. And he was serialized in the same magazine for pretty much his whole career. And that's just what he did. And that's kind of different from what you would usually find. So some people didn't really respect his work. They said, oh, it's either they thought it was for children or because it was about, this is a strange notion to me, but they thought, oh, because it's about science and is therefore like educational, it's not of any literary merit because you can't have both of those things.
Of course you can't have both of those things. Art can only entertain or inform. You have to pick one. We live in a binary world, and we are a binary girl.
It's this weird mirroring of the debate that often comes up now of literary fiction against genre fiction. It just shows that the people have been talking about the same thing since the 1800s.
I'm not surprised. There's still a lot of gatekeeping around writing and publishing. I think it's almost increased to a certain extent because they want to split the market into marketable pieces. And to have demographics, you need to clearly lay out what each thing is. Although there is more of a demand for blurred genres these days, I feel, possibly because people want more new stories, and new these days means combining old elements in new and interesting ways.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think I had anything else.
He liked hot air balloons.
He did like hot air balloons. He liked traveling. He liked geography.
Nerd.
He was fascinated with the world. I think it's partly due to this. I mean, if we want to know what's going on in South America, we can find some documentary on it and be like, hey, look at those cool frogs. Whereas maybe in that time, the best you could do was look in a book. So he was just fascinated by like exploring the world and all the different things in it. And that's why so many of his books are about exploring. And they do focus on that element a lot. And they just describe really cool things that you might see if you were to explore in the world. And it's very different to what we do nowadays, I think.
I mean, I can definitely see the demand for that kind of thing, particularly in a world where people didn't have as much privilege when it came to travel as we do now.
Yeah. I mean, he was basically travel writing, except he invented the things. And travel writing is now pretty big, so...
He wouldn't stay in lockdown. He'd be off in his hot air balloon.
I mean, as long as he's 2 feet away from the unknown.
It's a good way to social distance in a hot air balloon.
Yeah.
All right, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. As always, you can find all of our stories and previous episodes on our website at theshortstoryworkshop.com. If you would like to contact us, you can do so via Twitter. I am at MatsBWriter, Mel.
At Ficaholic.
And Simone.
T_M_typewriter, also known as the modern typewriter.
All right, thanks again for listening. We'll be back with another story next week. Goodbye.
Like tangent, but you do, because I've been at, like, for example, the theatre when we could still go to the theatre, and Finnish is a really rare language, so you don't meet a lot of other Finnish speakers. But there was this Finnish couple in front of me, and they were critiquing the crowd around them, like commenting on their hair and stuff or whatever, being really bitchy, and they didn't realise I could understand them.
Oh wow!
Just didn't even occur to them. Like, I do the same thing if I want to discuss something privately with my family. I switch to Finnish, and it's like, if anyone Finnish around us can actually understand us right now. Anyway, that was a complete tangent. My apologies.
The Finnish-speaking people could be lurking among you at any moment.
They can. We are always there. We are always listening.